If you ever move into a house and find a room that's been sealed shut, do not open it. Some doors are closed to protect you, not to hide something from you. The Thompson family learned this lesson in the worst way possible when they bought a farmhouse in rural Kansas and discovered a door that had been buried behind layers of concrete and plaster. What they released had been contained for 50 years, and within weeks, their dream home became a waking nightmare that would cost them everything. Mark Thompson had always believed in fresh starts. After years of cramped apartments and suffocating city noise, he wanted space for his family, air that didn't taste like exhaust, and a project that would let him build something with his own hands. When the listing for the 1,922 farmhouse appeared online, it felt like fate. 12 acres of Kansas prairie, original hardwood floors, and a price so low it seemed like someone had accidentally left off a zero. Mirabelle was hesitant at first, wondering why such a beautiful property was being sold for less than their 2-bedroom rental cost per year. But Mark's enthusiasm was infectious. He painted pictures of Emma running through fields of wildflowers and Lucas learning to climb trees in their own backyard. Within 3 weeks, they'd signed the papers and loaded up the moving truck, ready to escape the life that had been slowly crushing them. The house stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, framed by ancient oak trees that seemed to lean away from the structure rather than toward it. Mirabelle noticed this but said nothing, not wanting to dampen Mark's excitement as he carried their daughter across the threshold. Emma squealed with delight at the echoing space, her voice bouncing off walls that hadn't heard a child's laughter in decades. Lucas toddled from room to room, touching everything with his small hands, claiming his new kingdom. Mark stood in the center of the living room with blueprints spread across a makeshift table of cardboard boxes, already planning which walls to tear down and which beams to expose. This was his canvas, his masterpiece. He'd spent 15 years working construction for other people's dreams, and now he finally had his own. The first week was a blur of demolition and discovery. Mark attacked the dated drywall with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. Mirabelle homeschooled Emma in the mornings while Lucas napped, then spent afternoons stripping wallpaper that revealed layer after layer of the house's history. They found newspapers from 1952 stuffed in the walls as insulation, their headlines screaming about nuclear tests and communist threats. Behind a false panel in the kitchen, Mark discovered original tile work in pristine condition. Every revelation felt like a gift, confirmation that they'd made the right choice. But the price seemed too good to be true for a reason, and Mark was about to discover exactly why the previous owner had been so eager to sell. He was working alone in the northwest corner of the house on a Tuesday afternoon, tearing out a section of wall that seemed unnecessarily thick according to the blueprints. Mirabelle had taken the kids into town for groceries, and Mark relished the rare silence, just him and the rhythm of his work. The sledgehammer punched through drywall easily at first, revealing the expected studs and insulation. But when he pulled away a larger section, cold air rushed out with such force that it extinguished his work light. Mark fumbled for his flashlight, telling himself it was just a draft from outside, but the temperature in the room had dropped at least 20 degrees in seconds. His breath misted in front of his face as he shone the beam into the gap he'd created. There was another wall behind the drywall, not just another layer of construction, but a deliberate barrier made of mismatched materials. Wooden planks had been nailed horizontally across studs, then covered with what looked like hand-mixed plaster, then reinforced with concrete blocks that had been mortared in place with desperate, uneven strokes. Mark should have stopped when he felt the cold air seeping through the drywall, should have recognized that this wasn't renovation but excavation of something that had been deliberately buried. Instead, curiosity drove him forward. He widened the hole, pulling away drywall by the armful, until he could see the full scope of what someone had built. It was a doorway. The frame was original to the house, old oak that had darkened with age, but everything else about it screamed wrong. The door itself had been sealed from the outside with layer upon layer of material. Each application clearly added years apart, as if someone kept returning to reinforce their work. Nails jutted out at odd angles, some bent from the force of hammering. The plaster had been applied so thick in places that it had cracked and been reapplied. And strangest of all, someone had carved symbols into every visible inch of the wooden frame. Not decorative scroll work or the kind of folk art you might find in an old farmhouse, but harsh, angular marks that looked like they'd been gouged with a knife or chisel, deep enough that Mark could fit his finger into the grooves. He called Mirabelle. She arrived home to find him standing in a cloud of plaster dust, staring at the sealed door like he'd discovered King Tut's tomb. Emma pressed her face against Mirabelle's leg, suddenly quiet in a way that small children get when they sense something is deeply wrong. Lucas started to cry without any apparent reason, a keening wail that Mirabelle couldn't soothe. Mark barely noticed. He was already calculating how long it would take to break through, what tools he'd need, whether the door would even open once he cleared the barriers. Mirabelle asked him why someone would seal a door from the outside like that, and Mark gave her the answer he wanted to believe rather than the one his gut was screaming. Probably just closed off a damaged section of the house. Or maybe there was mold or structural issues they couldn't afford to fix properly. People did weird things in old houses, but he didn't believe his own explanation, and neither did Mirabelle. Still, they'd invested everything they had into this property. Walking away wasn't an option, and pretending the door didn't exist seemed impossible now that they knew it was there. Mark spent the next 2 days methodically removing the barriers. The concrete blocks came away in chunks, revealing more plaster underneath. The plaster had to be chipped off carefully to avoid damaging the original door. And the nails, there were hundreds of them, each one pulled with the screech of metal on wood that set everyone's teeth on edge. Emma started having nightmares on the second night, waking up screaming about the scratching sounds coming from the walls. Mirabelle chalked it up to stress from the move and the constant noise of renovation. But she'd heard the scratching too, in that twilight space between sleep and waking. On the third day, Mark finally cleared the last barrier. The door stood revealed in its entirety, and what he found behind that wall would destroy everything they'd built. The symbols he'd glimpsed on the frame covered every inch of the door's surface, carved so deeply and frantically that in some places the wood had splintered. They weren't random marks of vandalism, but deliberate patterns that repeated with slight variations, as if someone had been trying different combinations of the same protective spell. The symbols weren't decoration, they were a warning, one that Mark was too committed to heed. The door itself was unlocked. When Mark turned the blackened iron handle, it opened with a groan that sounded almost human. Mirabelle grabbed his arm, suddenly, desperate to stop him from going further, but it was too late. The door swung inward, and stale air rushed out carrying the smell of earth and something else, something rotten and sweet that made Mirabelle gag. Mark shone his flashlight into the space beyond. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no debris, no explanation for why someone would go to such extreme lengths to seal it away. But every square inch was a testament to absolute desperation. The walls were covered in scratches, thousands upon thousands of them, gouged into the plaster with such force that they'd reach the wooden lath beneath. The scratches weren't random, they formed patterns of pure terror, repetitive marks that climbed from floor to ceiling like someone had been clawing their way up toward a freedom they'd never reach. The ceiling bore the same treatment, as did the floor, which had been scratched down to bare wood in places. And most disturbing of all, the door they'd just opened had deep gouges on the inside too, concentrated around where the handle would be. Whatever had made those marks had been locked inside this room, and it had died trying to get out. The room felt like a throat that had been screaming for decades, and now that scream had finally been released. Mark stepped across the threshold, his work boots crunching on flakes of dried plaster that had been scraped from the walls. He touched one of the scratch marks, feeling how deep it went, trying to imagine what could have made it. Human fingernails wouldn't have cut this deep. Animal claws wouldn't have been able to reach the ceiling. The room was barely 8 feet square, a perfect cube of desperation and madness. Mirabelle stood in the doorway, refusing to enter, watching her husband examine their discovery with a growing sense of dread. She wanted to tell him to seal it back up, to nail it shut, and cover it with concrete, and forget they'd ever found it. But she knew Mark wouldn't listen. He'd already started talking about sanding the scratches smooth, about turning this space into a storage closet or maybe a reading nook. He couldn't see what she saw, that this room wasn't hidden architecture waiting to be reclaimed. It was a grave that they'd just opened. What the Thompsons didn't know was that the previous owner had spent his last years keeping something contained, and they'd just set it free. Mark spent the evening after opening the room researching historical explanations that would make sense of what they'd found. He sat at his laptop long after Mirabelle had gone to bed, scrolling through forums about old farmhouses and their peculiar architecture. He found stories about rooms sealed to contain tuberculosis patients during quarantine, about spaces where violent family members had been locked away in an era before psychiatric hospitals, about root cellars that had been converted into makeshift prisons during the Civil War. Each explanation seemed plausible enough to quiet the unease gnawing at his chest. By the time he closed the laptop at 2 a.m, Mark had convinced himself that the scratch marks were probably from a large dog or perhaps a mentally ill relative that the family had been too ashamed to institutionalize. It was tragic, certainly, but it was history. The room was just a room now, empty of whatever darkness it had once contained. Mirabelle didn't share his certainty but found herself nodding along when Mark suggested they renovate the space into something useful. They'd already invested so much time clearing the barriers, and the room did add nearly 70 square feet to the northwest wing. Mark proposed turning it into a playroom for the kids, somewhere Emma could spread out her art supplies and Lucas could keep his growing collection of toy trucks. The idea seemed almost redemptive, taking a space that had witnessed suffering and filling it with children's laughter. Mirabelle felt uneasy, but didn't want to waste the space, especially not after Mark had worked so hard to reveal it. She agreed on the condition that they'd thoroughly clean and repaint before letting the kids use it, trying to scrub away whatever psychic residue might cling to those scratched walls. They started the renovation the next morning. Mark sanded the scratches as smooth as the damaged plaster would allow, then applied joint compound to fill the deepest gouges. Mirabelle chose a cheerful yellow paint, bright and innocent, the kind of color that should banish shadows. Emma helped by painting wobbly flowers along the baseboard, delighted to have her own special project. Lucas mostly got paint in his hair and on his clothes, but his giggles filled the small space with exactly the kind of energy Mirabelle hoped would cleanse it. By evening, the room looked transformed, almost cheerful in the afternoon light streaming through the window they'd uncovered. Mark stood back and admired their work, satisfied that they'd reclaimed something broken and made it whole again. Within 48 hours, things began. Emma came to their bedroom on the second night, dragging her blanket and her stuffed rabbit, saying she didn't want to sleep in her room anymore. When Mirabelle asked why, Emma said someone was whispering to her through the walls. Not scary whispers exactly, she explained, but words she couldn't quite understand that made her feel like she needed to go somewhere. Mirabelle assumed she meant the bathroom and tucked her daughter into their bed, but Emma shook her head insistently. The whispers wanted her to go to the new room, the yellow one with her flowers on the wall. The whispers weren't words, they were hooks that dug into Emma's mind, pulling her towards something she was too young to understand but old enough to fear. Mark dismissed it as an overactive imagination, combined with the stress of moving and all the changes in their routine. Kids process things differently, he reminded Mirabelle, and Emma had always been sensitive. But that same night, Lucas woke up screaming at 3 a.m, a sound so primal and terror-filled that both parents bolted from bed convinced he was being murdered. They found him sitting up in his crib, eyes wide and unseeing, shrieking at something in the corner of his room that neither of them could see. Lucas's screams could shatter glass, pure animal terror pouring from his tiny body in waves. When Mark picked him up, the boy fought with surprising strength, clawing at his father's face and trying to twist away toward the door. It took 20 minutes to calm him down, and even then, Lucas kept whimpering and pointing at the corner, saying the tall man was still there, still watching. Mirabelle tried to convince herself it was just the house settling, that old farmhouses made strange noises and cast strange shadows, that their children were simply adjusting to a new environment. But deep down she knew better. She'd felt the temperature change in the northwest wing, noticed how the air turned thick and cold near the yellow room no matter how high they turned up the heat. The thermostat read 72 degrees, but standing in that hallway felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. Mark insisted it was just poor insulation in that section of the house, something they'd fix eventually. But Mirabelle noticed he'd started avoiding that wing after dark, taking longer routes through the house to avoid walking past the open doorway. On the third night, Lucas started sleepwalking. Mirabelle found him at 2 a.m, standing in the hallway outside their bedroom, facing the direction of the yellow room. His eyes were closed, but his body was tense, straining forward like a dog on a leash. When Mirabelle touched his shoulder, he didn't wake, but instead began shuffling toward the northwest wing with the mechanical precision of someone being guided. She called for Mark, and together they steered Lucas back to his room. But the moment they released him, he turned around and headed straight back toward that wing. They had to physically restrain him, his small body rigid and unnaturally strong, until finally his eyes fluttered open and he collapsed into tears, confused about why he was in the hallway and why his parents looked so frightened. The footsteps started on the fourth night. Mark heard them first, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth in the yellow room directly below their bedroom. The floorboards creaked with each step, a rhythm that suggested someone large and agitated, walking the same path over and over. Mark went downstairs with a baseball bat, convinced they had an intruder, but the yellow room was empty. The door stood open exactly as they'd left it, and nothing inside had been disturbed. He checked the windows, the locks, every possible point of entry, but everything was secure. Mirabelle joined him, and they stood in the doorway listening to the silence, wondering if they'd both imagined the sound. Then it started again, directly above them now, coming from their bedroom where they'd just been sleeping. Heavy footsteps, pacing, furious in their repetition. They ran back upstairs, but their bedroom was empty. Emma and Lucas were both asleep in their rooms, undisturbed. The footsteps had stopped the moment Mark and Mirabelle entered the hallway, but the cold remained, so intense that frost had begun forming on the inside of the window panes, despite it being late spring in Kansas. Mark touched the window and his fingers came away wet with condensation that shouldn't exist. The thing in that room had been alone for so long, and now it was hungry for the warmth of living bodies, the chaos of a family to torment. Then came the night that shattered any hope this was coincidence. Mirabelle woke at 3:47 in the morning to an empty bed. Mark had gotten up to use the bathroom, and she could hear water running in the pipes. She was about to drift back to sleep when she noticed the quality of silence in the house had changed, become expectant in a way that made her skin prickle. She got up and checked on Emma first, finding her daughter tangled in blankets but breathing steadily. Lucas's room was next, but his crib was empty. Mirabelle's heart seized. She ran into the hallway calling his name, waking Mark, who emerged from the bathroom with toothpaste still on his lips. They searched the house in a panic, checking closets and under beds and behind furniture, their voices growing more desperate with each empty room. Finally, Mirabelle saw him, a small silhouette at the end of the northwest hallway, standing in the doorway of the yellow room. Lucas stood perfectly still, facing into the darkness of that space. His pajamas seemed too small on his rigid frame, and his arms hung at his sides in a posture no 3-year-old would naturally adopt. Mirabelle approached slowly, fear making her movements careful, and when she got close enough to hear, she realized Lucas was speaking. The words were too low and steady for a toddler, emerging from his throat in a cadence that belonged to someone much older. The voice that came from their 3-year-old son was ancient and filled with venom, speaking in a language Mirabelle didn't recognize, but that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. Mark reached them and grabbed Lucas, pulling him away from the doorway. The boy's body was ice cold, so frigid that Mark could feel the chill through his pajamas like he'd been standing outside in winter. Lucas's eyes were rolled back, showing only white, and his lips continued moving even as Mark shook him and called his name. Mirabelle was crying, begging their son to wake up, but the ancient voice kept speaking, faster now, building towards something that felt like a crescendo. Then suddenly Lucas went completely limp, his body becoming dead weight in Mark's arms. The voice stopped. His eyes rolled forward again, but they were unfocused and glassy. He wasn't breathing. Mark started CPR on the hallway floor while Mirabelle called 911 with shaking hands. After 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours, Lucas gasped and started breathing again. But he didn't wake up. His skin was still too cold, his pulse too slow. The ambulance arrived 18 minutes later, and the paramedics rushed him to the hospital 40 minutes away in Wichita. Mark rode with them while Mirabelle followed with Emma, who'd woken up crying from the commotion. The doctors ran every test they could think of, checking for seizures and cardiac events and blood sugar problems, but everything came back normal. Lucas was stable, but unconscious, and no one could explain why. Then, a nurse noticed the marks. Dark bruises circled both of Lucas's wrists and both ankles, perfect rings that looked exactly like restraint marks. But these weren't the kind made by medical equipment or accidental injury. They were too precise, too deliberate, like someone had gripped the boy's limbs hard enough to leave impressions. The doctors questioned Mark and Mirabel carefully, their tones professional, but their implications clear. No one in the family had restrained Lucas, Mirabel insisted, her voice rising with desperation. The marks had appeared while he was unconscious, or maybe before. Maybe while he was standing in that doorway speaking in a voice that wasn't his. Lucas woke up 6 hours later with no memory of the incident. He seemed like himself again, asking for juice and his favorite stuffed dinosaur. But the bruises remained. The doctors kept him for observation and made careful notes in his chart that Mark knew would follow them. Mirabel sat beside their son's hospital bed, holding his small hand and staring at the marks around his wrist, and finally admitted what they'd both been avoiding. Something was wrong with that room. Something was wrong with their house. And what happened to Lucas was just a preview of the nightmare to come. They returned home the next day to a house that felt different, darker, despite the afternoon sun. The yellow room stood open at the end of the hallway, waiting. Mark closed the door for the first time since they'd unsealed it, but he could still feel something on the other side, pacing and patient and pleased with itself. But the entity targeting Lucas wasn't satisfied with just terrorizing the children. It wanted to break the entire family from the inside out. Mirabel packed suitcases, while Mark sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by property records and newspaper archives he'd printed at the library. She moved with frantic efficiency, throwing clothes into bags without folding them, not caring what matched or what got left behind. They were leaving, she told him. Tonight. They'd stay in a hotel until they could find an apartment, and they'd let the bank have the house back. She didn't care about the money they'd lose or the life they'd planned. Her son had stopped breathing in the hallway of this cursed place, and she would not spend another night under its roof. Mark understood her fear because he felt it too, a constant pressure in his chest that made it hard to take full breaths. But he couldn't shake the feeling that running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever had marked Lucas, whatever had spoken through him in that ancient voice, might not be content to let them simply walk away. He needed to understand what they were dealing with, needed to know if leaving would actually keep his family safe, or just spread the danger beyond the property line. Mirabel called him a fool, said he was choosing a house over his children, but Mark insisted they needed answers before they made any decisions. If they left without understanding what was happening, they might carry it with them like a disease. The property record showed the house had changed hands only 3 times since it was built in 1923. The original owners, the Mitchells, had lived there until 1968. Then, it sold to Ernest and Patricia Calloway, who Mark assumed were a married couple, until he found Patricia's death certificate dated 1976. After that, Ernest Calloway owned the property alone for 43 years until his death in 2019. The house had sat empty for almost 6 years before the estate finally sold it to the Thompsons. Mark found this strange, that a property in decent condition would remain unsold for so long, but the real estate listing offered no explanation beyond vague language about probate complications. Mark started searching for information about Ernest Calloway and found very little. No social media presence, which wasn't surprising for someone who would have been in his 80s. No obituary in the local paper. Just a bare death notice with no service information. But Mark did find a daughter listed in the estate documents, a Rebecca Calloway Martinez who lived in Colorado Springs. It took him 3 hours of searching to find a phone number, and another 2 hours to work up the courage to call it. When a woman answered, Mark explained that he'd bought her father's property and had some questions about the house's history. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Mark thought she'd hung up. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice tight with an emotion Mark couldn't identify. She asked him if he'd opened the sealed room. Mark felt his stomach drop at the phrasing. The way she said, sealed room, as if it were a proper noun. A specific thing she'd been dreading someone would disturb. He admitted that they had, and Rebecca made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, or both. She told him she'd prayed that whoever bought the house would have the good sense to leave. That door alone, that maybe the seals would hold for another generation or until the house finally collapsed into rubble. Mark asked if they could meet, said he needed to understand what was happening to his family. Rebecca agreed but insisted they meet at a coffee shop in Wichita, somewhere public and far from the farmhouse. She'd drive up the next morning. That night, Mark slept on the couch in the living room, while Mirabel barricaded herself and the children in the master bedroom. She'd pushed the dresser in front of the door and kept every light on. sitting up against the headboard with Emma on one side and Lucas on the other, watching the door handle like it might turn at any moment. Mark lay awake listening to the house, hearing every creak and groan in the old bones of the structure. The footsteps didn't return, but something worse did. Around 4 a.m, Mark heard humming coming from the northwest wing. A woman's voice, tuneless and wandering, humming a melody that made his skin crawl. He didn't investigate. He pulled his blanket over his head like a child and waited for dawn. Rebecca Calloway Martinez was a small woman in her early 50s with gray threaded through her dark hair and circles under her eyes that suggested she didn't sleep well. She arrived at the coffee shop before Mark and was already sitting at a corner booth, both hands wrapped around a cup that had stopped steaming. When Mark sat down across from her, she studied his face for a long moment before speaking. She told him he looked tired, and Mark almost laughed because tired didn't begin to cover the bone-deep exhaustion that came from terror. Rebecca nodded like she understood, and then she started talking. Ernest Calloway hadn't been her father by blood but by marriage. Her mother, Patricia, had been married to Ernest when Rebecca was 6 years old, escaping an abusive first marriage. Ernest had been kind to Rebecca, patient in a way her biological father never was, and he'd treated her like his own daughter. They'd been happy at the farmhouse for the first few years. Then Ernest's younger brother, Daniel, came to stay with them. Daniel was troubled, Rebecca said, choosing her words carefully. He'd been in and out of psychiatric facilities, experimenting with drugs, involved with dangerous people who believed in dangerous things. Ernest had taken him in out of family obligation, hoping that the quiet of the farm and Patricia's gentle presence would help Daniel find stability. What Mark uncovered was so disturbing he considered never telling Maribel, but Rebecca's next words made that impossible. In 1974, Daniel converted the small room in the northwest wing into what he called his study. He covered the windows, brought in books and candles and items that Ernest didn't recognize. Patricia was uncomfortable with Daniel's interests, but Ernest defended his brother, said everyone needed their own space and their own path. That tolerance lasted until Ernest found the journals. Daniel had been performing rituals, following instructions from texts that Ernest burned before Rebecca was old enough to see them. The rituals his brother performed had torn a hole in reality itself. Daniel had written, a doorway through which something could be summoned and bound to serve the summoner's will. Rebecca's voice dropped to barely above a whisper when she described what happened next. 2 people died in that room over the course of 3 weeks in September of 1974. The first was a drifter Daniel had befriended in town, someone with no family to report him missing. The second was Patricia. The official report said she'd had a heart attack, but Ernest told Rebecca years later that what he'd found in that room, what had been done to his wife, didn't match any natural cause of death. Daniel disappeared the night Patricia died, and Ernest never saw his brother again. But something remained in the room, something that Daniel had summoned but failed to control. Ernest Calloway hadn't been a recluse by choice. He was a prisoner, bound to the property by the knowledge that if he left for too long, the thing in that room would break free. He'd sealed the door immediately after Patricia's death, layering protection after protection, spending his entire savings on consultations with people who understood what he was dealing with. Some were frauds, but a few gave him real guidance. The symbols on the door weren't decoration, they were a warning written in languages older than English, binding spells and protective wards that Ernest reinforced every few years as they weakened. He'd lived alone in that house for 43 years, never taking a vacation, never visiting Rebecca more than a few hours' drive away, never sleeping anywhere but in that farmhouse where he could monitor the seal. Ernest had sacrificed his entire life to keep that thing caged. Rebecca's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and showed Mark photos of her father's journals, pages he'd kept until the end, documenting his vigil. The entries were obsessive and detailed, noting temperature fluctuations near the sealed room, strange sounds, dreams that felt like intrusions. Ernest had measured the seal's integrity with instruments Rebecca didn't understand, and toward the end of his life, he'd noted with growing despair that the bindings were weakening. He was old and tired, and he didn't know how much longer he could maintain them. His final entry, dated just days before his death, read simply, "I've done all I can. God forgive whoever opens that door." The daughter's face went white when Mark mentioned they'd opened the room. but it went completely ashen when he described breaking through the concrete blocks, pulling out the nails, chipping away the plaster. Rebecca asked him how many separate barriers they'd removed, and Mark thought back, counting them off. The drywall they'd torn down, the wooden planks, the concrete blocks, the plaster behind those, the nails, which had been applied in distinct layers, the inner wooden bracing. The door itself had been the seventh seal. 7 layers of protection, each one a barrier that had to be breached. Rebecca put her head in her hands and told Mark something her father had said in his last phone call to her, the day before he died, of what the coroner ruled a heart attack. Ernest had been rambling, confused in a way that frightened Rebecca because her father's mind had always been sharp. He kept repeating a phrase, "If that door ever opens, it won't stop until it takes what it's owed." 7 souls for 7 seals. Rebecca had thought it was dementia or medication talking, but now she understood with horrible clarity that her father had been trying to warn her. The entity Daniel had summoned required a price for its service, and that price was blood. 7 lives to fully manifest in the world, to break free of the room that had become its prison. Mark felt his vision narrow, his breath coming in short gasps. He asked Rebecca if she knew whether anyone had died recently around the property. Rebecca pulled up a news article on her phone from 3 weeks earlier. A real estate agent named Jennifer Morris had been killed in a single car accident on Route 37, not far from the farmhouse. She'd lost control and hit a tree at high speed despite good weather and straight road. Jennifer Morris had been their realtor, the woman who'd shown them the property and pushed for a quick sale. Mark remembered her nervousness during the showing, how she'd rushed them through the house and avoided the northwest wing entirely. 2 deaths down, 5 to go, and the Thompsons had no idea they were already on the list. Rebecca grabbed Mark's hand across the table, her grip surprisingly strong. She begged him not to go back to the house, to take his family and leave immediately, to let the entity have the empty structure if that's what it wanted. But Mark explained what had happened to Lucas, the marks on his wrists, the way the thing seemed to be focusing on the children. Rebecca's expression shifted from fear to something worse, recognition. Her father's journals had mentioned that the entity preferred the young, that children's life force burned brighter and could sustain it longer. The entity wasn't just evil, it was vengeance given form, rage at being trapped for 50 years, and it would take particular pleasure in destroying the family that had freed it. Mark asked if there was any way to stop it, to reseal the door, or banish the thing back to wherever Daniel had summoned it from. Rebecca shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Her father had spent decades researching that exact question. The bindings he'd created were the best he could manage, and they'd required constant maintenance. Even if Mark could recreate the seals, they'd already broken the primary barrier. The entity had tasted freedom. It wouldn't go back willingly, and forcing it would require knowledge and power that Ernest had spent his whole life acquiring. Mark didn't have 43 years. Based on what happened to Lucas, he might not have 43 hours. Rebecca wrote down the name of someone her father had consulted, a researcher at a university who specialized in occult history. She couldn't promise this person would help or even believe Mark's story, but it was the only lead she had. As Mark stood to leave, Rebecca caught his sleeve. She told him her father's last words to her, spoken in a lucid moment before the heart attack took him. Ernest had said he'd failed, that he'd held the line as long as he could, but in the end, he couldn't protect the next family that would inevitably buy the house. He'd asked Rebecca to forgive him, and then he died. Rebecca believed her father's heart had given out from the accumulated stress of 5 decades of fear, but she also wondered if somehow the entity had reached out and claimed him the moment the seal was finally broken. Mark rushed home, praying he wasn't too late, but the entity had already chosen its next victim. Mark found Mirabelle exactly where he'd left her, barricaded in the master bedroom with both children pressed against her sides. But the scene had deteriorated in the 4 hours he'd been gone. The dresser no longer merely blocked the door, it had been reinforced with the nightstands, the desk chair, and every piece of movable furniture Mirabelle could drag across the room. Emma sat on the bed with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly and humming that same tuneless melody Mark had heard at 4 in the morning. Lucas was asleep, but twitching violently, trapped in dreams that made him whimper and claw at his own face. Mirabelle's eyes were red and wild, and when Mark knocked and identified himself, She made him recite their wedding vows through the door before she'd let him in. While Mark had been meeting with Rebecca, every door in the house had slammed simultaneously at 11:37 in the morning, not sequentially like wind blowing through, but all at once with such force that pictures fell off walls and dishes shattered in the kitchen cabinets. Mirabelle had been making lunch when it happened, and the percussion of it knocked her to her knees. Emma started screaming, and Lucas woke from his nap crying in a way that sounded more like choking. Mirabelle grabbed both children and ran for the master bedroom, the only room with a lock that felt substantial. She'd barely gotten the dresser in place when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Something walked through the house for the next 2 hours, moving with deliberate heaviness that shook the floorboards. The steps would approach the bedroom door, pause for long minutes, while Mirabelle held her breath and covered the children's mouths, then retreat down the hallway, only to return moments later from a different direction. Whatever was walking didn't breathe like a human. The sound was wet and labored, air moving through something that shouldn't have lungs. It stopped directly outside their door and stayed there for 30 minutes, breathing heavily, while Mirabelle clutched a pair of scissors and prepared to fight for her children's lives. Then it had simply walked away, and the house fell into a silence that felt even more threatening than the sounds had been. Mark listened to Mirabelle's account with mounting dread, recognizing that the entity was escalating far faster than he'd anticipated. He told her everything Rebecca had revealed, about the 7 seals and the 7 souls, about Ernest's lifetime of imprisonment, and the price Daniel's ritual demanded. Mirabelle's response was immediate and absolute. They were leaving, right now. Mark could stay if he wanted to play hero, but she was taking Emma and Lucas somewhere safe. She began repacking the suitcases she'd started the night before, moving with manic efficiency while Mark tried to explain that running might not work, that the entity might follow them, or worse, but escaping was never going to be that simple. When they carried the luggage to the driveway 15 minutes later, both cars were dead. Mark tried his truck first, turning the key to complete silence. No clicking, no struggling engine, just nothing. Mirabelle's sedan was the same, the dashboard lights refusing to illuminate despite the battery being less than a year old. Mark popped both hoods and found the batteries completely drained, the terminals corroded in a way that should have taken years to develop. His phone was dead too, even though he'd charged it to full that morning. When he tried to plug it into the car charger, nothing happened. Mirabelle's phone showed a single bar of service, fluctuating and weak, but at least it was something. They went back inside to use the landline, except the Thompsons didn't have a landline. The previous owner had disconnected it, and they'd never bothered to reactivate service. Yet as they stood in the kitchen debating their next move, a phone rang. The sound came from the living room, tinny and old-fashioned, the mechanical bell ring of a rotary phone. They followed the sound to an outlet near the fireplace, where a phone cord emerged from the wall jack and disappeared into nothing. Yet the ringing continued. Mirabelle's cell phone buzzed in her pocket, and when she looked at the screen, it showed an incoming call from their home number, a landline that didn't exist, calling a cell phone from inside the same house. The entity wasn't just stronger, it was learning about them, studying their fears and finding new ways to demonstrate its control. Mark understood then that they were trapped, that the house had become a living prison and they were the inmates. The entity was toying with them, showing them that it could manipulate their technology, their environment, the very fabric of their reality. Mirabelle collapsed into Mark's arms, her strength finally breaking, and he held her while she sobbed, and Emma watched with eyes too old for a 6-year-old. That night, Mark made a decision. If they couldn't leave, he'd reseal the door and hope that recreating even a crude version of Ernest's barriers might weaken the entity enough for them to escape. He found boards in the garage and a hammer, nails left over from the renovation. Mirabelle kept the children in the bedroom while Mark approached the yellow room, now stripped of its cheerful paint and looking exactly like what it was, a cell with a door standing open. The temperature dropped with each step he took down that hallway, his breath misting and his fingers going numb despite it being May. Mark positioned the first board across the doorframe and raised the hammer. The first nail went in smoothly, the sound of metal biting into wood oddly comforting in its normalcy. The second nail bent, the third bounced off the wood entirely, despite Mark striking it squarely. He was lining up the fourth when he felt breath on the back of his neck, warm and fetid, carrying the smell of earth and rot. A voice spoke directly into his ear, so close he could feel the vibration of it in his skull. The entity's presence was suffocating, a weight that crushed the air from his lungs and made his vision tunnel. The voice told him exactly how each member of his family would die. It described Emma's death in detail that made Mark's stomach heave. A prolonged suffering that would take days. It showed him Lucas's final moments, terror and confusion, as his 3-year-old mind tried to understand why his parents couldn't protect him. It saved Mirabel for last, promising Mark that he'd watch it happen, that he'd be alive and aware for every second of her destruction. What it showed Mark in those whispers would haunt him forever. Images branded into his mind with such clarity that he knew he'd never sleep without seeing them. The voice wasn't making threats, it was making promises, sharing its plans with the satisfaction of something that knew it couldn't be stopped. Mark swung the hammer blindly behind him, but it connected with nothing but air. The presence vanished instantly, and he stumbled forward into the doorframe, gasping and shaking. The board he'd been nailing had fallen to the floor, and when Mark looked at the doorframe, he saw the wood was blackened where his hand had touched it, burned in the perfect impression of his palm print. He abandoned the supplies and fled back to the bedroom, unable to articulate what had just happened, but knowing with certainty that physical barriers wouldn't contain this thing. They took turns sleeping that night, one parent always awake and watching. Mark had the midnight to 3 shift, sitting in the chair by the window while his family slept. He kept his eyes on the bedroom door, watching the crack of light from the hallway for any shadows that didn't belong. At 2:47, he noticed Emma wasn't in the bed. He checked the bathroom, the closet, under the bed, his panic rising with each empty space. Mirabel woke to his frantic searching, and they found Lucas alone in the bed, still twitching through his nightmares. They searched the house, calling Emma's name in harsh whispers, afraid to make too much noise but desperate to find her. Mark reached the northwest wing first and saw light coming from the yellow room. His daughter stood in the center of the space, facing away from the door. Her arms were raised in front of her, and she was making small, repetitive movements that Mark couldn't initially understand. As he got closer, he heard her voice, a broken whisper repeating the same phrase over and over. "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts." Emma was carving symbols into her own arms with her fingernails, the same angular marks that had covered the doorframe. Her fingernails were broken and bleeding from the effort, but she continued, methodically, tracing patterns into her skin with precision no 6-year-old should possess. Tears streamed down her face, but her expression was blank, disconnected from the pain her body was experiencing. Blood dripped onto the floor, and Mark realized with horror that she'd been standing there long enough to create a small pool at her feet. Mirabel pushed past Mark and grabbed Emma, spinning her around and trying to stop her hands. Emma's eyes were unfocused, looking through her mother rather than at her, and she continued the carving motions even without contact with her skin. Mirabel shook her, called her name, begged her to wake up. For a moment, Emma's eyes focused, and Mirabel felt a surge of hope. Then, her daughter's face rearranged itself into an expression that belonged to something ancient and cruel. Emma's voice had been replaced by something that sounded like grinding metal, words emerging from her throat in layers, as if multiple voices were speaking at once using her vocal cords. "3 more, the thing said through Emma's mouth, and I'm free." Mirabel screamed and dropped her daughter, unable to maintain contact with a body that was occupied by something so fundamentally wrong. Emma collapsed to the floor, the entity releasing her as suddenly as it had taken control. The girl curled into a ball, fully herself again, sobbing and asking why her arms hurt so much. Mark scooped her up and ran from the yellow room, Mirabel right behind him, and they barricaded themselves back in the master bedroom. They wrapped Emma's arms in towels, the cuts deeper than they'd first appeared, and held both children while they all cried. For Mirabel, seeing her daughter's body controlled by something inhuman was the breaking point. She looked at Mark with a mixture of terror and accusation, and he knew she was right to blame him. He'd opened the door. He'd insisted they could make this work. He'd brought his family to this place and trapped them with something that was systematically destroying them from the inside out. Mark realized with soul-crushing horror that they couldn't fight this thing, they could only try to contain it again, and the ritual would require a sacrifice none of them were prepared to make. Mark spent the morning making calls from Mirabel's dying cell phone, burning through the single bar of service with desperate efficiency. The priest arrived first, a young man from the Catholic church in town who'd probably never encountered anything beyond routine blessings and confessions. He took one look at the yellow room, at the symbols carved into Emma's bandaged arms, at the scratches appearing on the walls in real time as they watched, and he left. He apologized profusely, said he'd pray for them, but Mark saw the truth in his eyes. The priest was terrified, and whatever authority his collar carried meant nothing against what occupied this house. The paranormal researcher arrived 3 hours later. Dr. Elena Voss was a professor of folklore and occult history from the university Rebecca had mentioned, a severe woman in her 60s who listened to Mark's frantic explanation with clinical detachment. She walked through the house, taking measurements with instruments Mark didn't recognize, spending the longest time in the yellow room where she photographed the scratch marks and studied the symbols on the doorframe with a magnifying glass. When she finally sat down with Mark and Mirabelle at the kitchen table, her expression was grim. Dr. Voss explained what Ernest Calloway had spent decades learning through trial and terrible error. The entity Daniel had summoned couldn't be banished because it wasn't a demon or spirit in the traditional sense. The rituals his brother performed had torn a hole in reality itself, creating a doorway through which something had emerged from a place where physics and mortality worked differently. Once such a doorway opened, it couldn't simply be closed. It could only be contained through continuous application of human life force, a conscious will holding it in check every moment of every day. Ernest's external seals had worked because he'd bound his own life energy to them, sacrificing his freedom and eventually his health to maintain the barrier. The priest's hands shook as he explained what the ritual would cost, though Dr. Voss's hands remained steady as she laid out the only option available to them. Someone would need to enter the yellow room voluntarily and perform a binding ritual that would seal them inside with the entity. This wasn't just about trapping the entity, it was about feeding it enough life force to keep it satisfied, giving it a constant source of human consciousness to feed on so it wouldn't hunger for others. The person who entered that room would remain conscious and aware, acting as both prisoner and jailer until their natural death. Only then would the binding break and the entity be free to claim another victim unless someone else took their place. Mirabelle asked why Daniel hadn't done this if he was the one who'd summoned the thing. Dr. Voss explained that Daniel was supposed to be the sacrifice that was the bargain the ritual demanded, but he'd lost his nerve after the entity killed his first victim, and after it took Patricia, he'd fled entirely. Ernest discovered too late that the only way to contain something this powerful required someone inside the room with it. But by then, the entity had tasted freedom and wouldn't allow anyone to enter without a fight. So Ernest did what he could from the outside, creating layer upon layer of seals, powered by his own dwindling life force, knowing it was a temporary solution that would fail the moment he died or someone broke the barriers. Mark knew he was signing his own death warrant, but it was the only way to save his family. He looked at Mirabelle across the table and saw in her eyes that she understood what he was about to say before he spoke the words. He would do it. He would seal himself in that room and take Ernest's place, give the entity what it wanted so Mirabelle could take Emma and Lucas somewhere safe. The children could grow up, have normal lives, never knowing the full extent of what their father had sacrificed. It was his fault they'd opened the door, his arrogance and curiosity that had condemned them all. He had to be the one to close it. Mirabelle shattered. She begged him to find another way, said they could all leave together and let someone else deal with the house. But Dr. Voss shook her head. The entity had already chosen the Thompson family. It knew their fears, had tasted their children's terror, and it wouldn't simply let them walk away. If Mark didn't contain it, the thing would hunt them wherever they went, picking them off one by one until it had its 7 souls. At least this way, 3 of them would survive. The entity seemed to sense that its time was running short, that the Thompsons were planning something that might trap it again. That afternoon, it stopped hiding. The thing that manifested was an abomination, a violation of nature itself. It appeared in the hallway as a towering shadow that bent at wrong angles. Too many limbs extending from a central mass that hurt to look at directly. Its face shifted constantly, cycling through expressions of agony and rage that Mark realized with horror were the faces of everyone it had ever killed. He saw Patricia Calloway's features twist across the shadow, saw the drifter's terrified eyes, saw people he didn't recognize screaming silently from within the entity's form. It attacked Mark physically for the first time, manifesting enough substance to rake claws across his chest that left deep gouges bleeding through his shirt. The pain was immediate and shocking. proof that this thing could kill them whenever it chose. Every second it existed in the world was a wound in reality. And Mark understood that Dr. Voss had been right. They didn't have time to debate or plan. They had maybe 24 hours before it claimed its seventh victim and became unstoppable, fully manifested, and no longer bound by the room's limitations. Mirabel found Lucas in his bedroom that evening, standing on his toy box with a bedsheet tied around his neck and looped over the closet rod. The boy wasn't possessed. This time his eyes were his own, filled with tears and confusion. He told his mother that the tall shadow man said it would stop hurting Emma if Lucas went to sleep and didn't wake up. The entity was forcing them toward death, manipulating a 3-year-old's desire to protect his sister into a compulsion toward suicide. Mirabel cut him down and held him while he sobbed, and when she emerged from the room with Lucas in her arms, she looked at Mark and nodded. They were out of time and out of options. Mark spent his last evening with his family memorizing their faces. He read Emma her favorite book 3 times, even though she was too traumatized to really listen. He held Lucas until the boy finally fell into an exhausted sleep. Nightmares kept at bay by sheer physical and emotional depletion. He and Mirabel didn't talk much, just sat together on the couch, holding hands while the house creaked and settled around them. What was there to say that would make this bearable? Mark was choosing a fate worse than death-conscious imprisonment with a demon for decades, feeding it his life force piece by piece until there was nothing left. Dr. Voss returned at midnight with the materials Mark would need for the binding ritual: candles, salt, symbols written in Latin that Mark would have to recite while sealing himself inside. She explained the process clinically, warning him that the entity would fight the binding, that it would show him things designed to break his resolve. He had to remain strong, had to complete the ritual no matter what horrors it manifested. Once the binding was complete and the door sealed, Mirabel should take the children and never return. The house would stand as Mark's prison for however many years he survived, and the entity would be forced to content itself with his consciousness alone. Mark kissed his children while they slept, then held Mirabel for a long moment at the threshold of the master bedroom. She asked him not to do this, even though they both knew there was no alternative. He told her he loved her, that he was sorry, that she should tell the children their father died in an accident so they wouldn't grow up knowing the truth. Then he picked up the ritual, materials, and walked down the hallway toward the yellow room, each step carrying him closer to a living death. What they didn't realize was that the entity had been orchestrating this exact outcome from the beginning, but the entity had one final, devastating trick that would make Mark's sacrifice mean nothing. Mark stepped across the threshold at exactly midnight, candles in one hand and a trembling sheet of Latin incantations in the other. Mirabel had already carried the children to the car, engine running at the property line. The moment his foot touched the yellow room's floor, the entity manifested with such force that the candles blew out and the temperature plunged below freezing. Reality fractured around him, a writhing mass of darkness showing visions meant to destroy his resolve. He saw Emma's death in excruciating detail, Lucas suffering in ways no child should endure, and Mirabel's final moments so vividly his. Knees buckled. The entity whispered in a dozen voices, offering bargains. Take Mirabel instead. Accept Emma as payment. Spare Mark if he'd just walk away. Mark relit the candles with shaking hands and began the incantation, Latin words spilling from his lips as tears streamed down his face. The walls reacted, plaster reforming over the doorway at supernatural speed, sealing him inside. Then realization struck. The entity wasn't resisting, it was letting him finish. And in that moment of clarity, Mark understood the truth. The entity hadn't needed 7 deaths. It needed 7 seals broken by 7 people. Mark had broken 3 during demolition. Mirabel had removed 2 layers of protection. Emma, while possessed, had broken 1 with her corrupted will. Lucas, compelled toward the door, had shattered the final binding. The 7 seals weren't protections, they were locks that required 7 willing participants to open the doorway. Everything Ernest had done for 50 years, every sacrifice, every lonely year was undone the moment all 7 touched those barriers. The entity had been free since Lucas's touch. It had manipulated them, guiding Mark into sealing himself inside while it remained outside. The containment was never about killing. Ernest had kept the entity tethered by living on the property, a human anchor holding it there. Now Mark had removed himself from the equation, locking himself inside the very cage meant to hold it. Through the narrowing gap in the doorway, he saw the shadow turn and calmly walk down the hallway toward the front door. Its laughter echoed through the house, mocking, victorious. Mirabelle's scream pierced the night. Mark threw himself at the sealed door, pounding until his fists bled, but it wouldn't budge. Through a hair-thin crack, he saw the entity crossing the lawn toward his family. The car's engine died. The headlights flickered out. Mirabelle's screams grew desperate, then stopped. Mark's own screams tore through the room, primal and broken, as he listened to his family die beyond the door he'd sealed with his own life force. He clawed at the walls, leaving desperate scratches, the same ones he'd found when they first opened the room, the same marks Ernest's brother Daniel had made decades ago after realizing too late that the entity had already escaped. Then came silence, the silence of hope dying. Mark collapsed against the door, blood dripping from his torn nails, as the entity's laughter returned. It was inside the house now, savoring its freedom after 50 years of captivity. Mark had become the guardian of an empty prison. The room had never been meant to hold the entity it was built to keep humans in, and Mark had stepped willingly into his own tomb.